Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last LawHelp Interactive, or LHI, community call of the year. I am delighted to be joined today by Bart Earle and Mark Lortzen of Capstone Practice Systems. My name is Marinda Migueli. I'm the Partnerships Manager at LawHelp Interactive, project of Pro Bono Net, and thank you so much for joining us for this call today. So hopefully folks can see my screen. I'll be sharing links displayed on the screen into the chat box. The first of which is a link to where today's materials and the call's recording will be added to the LHI Resource Center. So just as a reminder or a heads up for those joining for the first time, we record all of these LHI community calls and post the recording and the materials for future reference. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with updates and announcements. Then we're going to move to our main presentation today, which is about reusing LHI content and best practices around that. So Capstone Practice Systems is going to cover that topic. Then we have times for questions, comments, and discussion, but we encourage you to participate throughout the call. That makes it better for us and better for you. You can raise your hand and we can unmute you, or you can enter questions in the chat box. It's a small group, so we hope to hear from you, and we hope you feel comfortable asking questions and making comments. So in terms of updates and announcements, first just wanted to share for those who aren't aware that we had our last code release of the year last Thursday. The main change in that code release was making some enhancements to a newish feature that allows for email submission of LHI documents and attachments to a pre-designated court or agency email address. And we're planning our next code release for January. That will likely include a consolidated start interview page. So right now, anonymous users, they'll see they'll land on a start interview page. There's a separate terms of use page. We're trying to reduce the number of clicks that our end users have to do so that they can more quickly and more seamlessly complete the LHI process. We're also continuing work to re-implement load balancing on the LHI system. A few months ago, we had an issue with one of our servers on LHI. So as a temporary measure, we wound that server down and have been working since then to re-implement a second server to support load balancing on the system. We'll also be sharing the LHI end user survey. So this is something that we do on an annual basis to get feedback on the experience of end users using the system. In terms of upcoming and recent trainings and conferences, we have the LSC Innovations in Technology Conference happening just a few weeks from now, and wanted to plug a session with our partners in DC and Michigan that I'll also be moderating, and I can share the link to that in the chat box in a moment. As you may have seen, the next Equal Justice Conference, which was originally planned to take place in Dallas, Texas, I believe, is now going to be held virtually, and more details are going to follow on that conference. I wanted to plug last week's National Tech webinar. We had a really nice group of panelists talking about processes for converting complex legal know-how into well-behaving interactive applications. So I'll drop the link to that recording in the chat box as well. And just as a heads up, we will be shifting to a bi-monthly schedule beginning next year for these LHI community calls. So we want to have meet less frequently, but have really helpful and targeted topics so that when you do join us, you get a lot from those discussions. So hopefully this isn't a newsflash to anybody, but Adobe has an end of life date for December 31st for Flash. So beginning January 12th, I believe, they will be actively blocking Flash into, or end of life January, but there'll be additional steps taken January 12th, even though it's end of life December 31st. In any event, we want you to, if you haven't transitioned from A2J4 to A2J6, you need to do that ASAP. You also should start removing links to A2J4 content so that you don't have frustrated users trying to access LHI powered interviews that won't work. I also want to briefly show a usability issue for your consideration and feedback around language toggle, but also want to flag that LHI has served over 1 million interviews already in 2020. So this is due to the great work on including that done by many folks on this call in the LHI community. And that's despite a significant drop in utilization in the second quarter of 2020, around the time where things really started to begin to shut down around the COVID-19 public health emergency. So I wanted to shout that out, and then I'll talk a little bit about the language toggle issue. So I'm going to go to an LHI interview. To demonstrate this potential issue. Actually, let me pick another one because that's in Connect. Although the same principle applies, whether you're using a Connect interview or traditional LHI interview. So we got a report from an end user who landed on an English interview and saw this toggle option on the top of the page and decided they wanted to take a Spanish version of the interview. So they toggled to Spanish. Now the LHI wrapper will change when you use that toggle to whichever language you select. Language within the Hot Docs interview in terms of the navigation bars, for instance, if it's a Hot Docs interview, will change as well. But that doesn't necessarily change the language in the interview that's being authored. So the person move forward with the interview. Like I'm doing now. And was frustrated because they saw English interview questions in text, even though the navigation bar is translated to Spanish. So I guess what it would be helpful to think about is, there are cases where it is helpful to have that toggle available. Advocates may want to be able to move back and forth and understand that they might have to start a different version of the interview to get a different language. But is having this sort of universal toggle creating a usability issue, and that people assume not just parts of the site, but the site universally changes when you toggle? And what are some ways that you would like to see LHI address it if this is a usability issue? So if you have any thoughts, please raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can enter a question or a comment in the chat box. If the question doesn't make sense, please let me know as well.
Is it fair to say, Miranda, right now 95% or more of our interviews are English only, right? So a lot of folks may find if they choose Spanish for the outer LHI experience, as soon as they get to the interview, it's not going to be in a language they expect.
Yes, I think that's more than fair to say.
So. We just need to translate everything. That's the solution.
Right. And I guess I should also say that when you start an interview that has been designated as, say, Spanish, in the interview metadata page, and the system knows to translate the LHI wrapper, the navigation buttons, etc., to Spanish. So I'm not suggesting that there would not be this translation of those
Right.
pieces, even if we were to modify or remove the toggle, but just is there a better approach? And maybe that's something folks can navigate on. I don't see any comments or any raised hands. So feel free to marinate on that, and I will turn things over to Capstone for the next part of the discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Miranda. This is Mark Lauritsen. I'm here with Bart Earl. Let me just grab the screen for the second. Let me see if I can do that. Make myself presenter. Our theme today really is talking about reuse. How do folks who want to do a project that might be based upon something similar someone else has done take advantage of all the reusability built into LawHelp Interactive? And I thought I'd start out in the spirit of reuse by very quickly reprising a slideshow I did with our colleague Alan Sudikov, who we lost back in 2010, in 2007 on one of these calls. And I assume you're seeing my screen. And then I'm going to go to LHI and just show something much more practical. But the idea back then, and I think it remains the case, is that we at LawHelp Interactive and related services are very much in the business of trying to help people who have knowledge about how to get legal work done reuse that knowledge without having to hire and pay for a lawyer, even if you can afford one, and interact with software that can guide you through questions and answers and guidance and generate documents. There are a lot of ways in which we use law practice knowledge this way. We have these dynamic interviews, we have libraries of templates, we model documents in various ways so that they know what words go where under what circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can store your answers to these interviews on a site like LHI and reuse your stored answers. So there's a lot of reuse built in. I forget what I was doing on this slide. I was just talking about my own history about the evolution of legal tech. I'm going to skip that right now, but point out that this approach does require some sharing. And one of the things that's been built into LHI from the get-go was this idea of a software commons, a collection of content that we build and share and reuse and steal from each other and improve upon, and try to avoid the not invented here syndrome, which seems to beset many organizations, especially for-profit organizations, but also legal aid programs and courts. But that requires infrastructure and lots of ongoing managerial attention. So the next level up, though, is suppose you've got a number of these systems like we have, modules, interviews, A to J, hot docs on a site like LHI. How can you reuse them? They themselves are instruments for reuse. But how can we reuse the knowledge that's been embodied in these systems, the know-how? Both technical and substantive involved in the projects, the good practices that are expressed in these things, the kind of decision frameworks we've used to choose how to implement forms, whether it's RTF or PDF, et cetera, et cetera. And I think on the right-hand side of the screen are things that you've come to expect from a site like LHI, ongoing trainings and meetings like this, ongoing mentoring and support, publications, articles, periodic news, attempts to standardize some of the things that can be standardized, and the contributor portal, which we'll get back to in a second. 2007 was when what became LHI was still referred to as NPADO, which stood for National Public Automated Documents Online, kind of an unwieldy name, and various kinds of system kits. The encouragement back then, and I think still today for folks that are doing this kind of work, is if you're about to build a system with forms of type X in your jurisdiction, it's worth it to spend a little time to see who else already has done some of what you're about to do. And in a moment, we'll see how you can do that on LHI and the contributor portal. find the closest systems to what you've done if they exist, download them, explore them, and go at it. Copy them, revise them, extend them, and once you're done, pass it forward. Post the results of what you've created back for others to use. And the whole ecosystem of LawHelp Interactive is very much driven by that ethos. How do we maximize the amount of sharing and reuse and minimize the unnecessary reinvention? There are, of course, some cautions to be aware of. Jurisdictions are notoriously different, not only in terms of vocabulary, how we call things and name things in our forms and our procedures, but in the substantive law. So if you copy something from one state, you may get it wrong in your state. Theoretically, reusing may constrain your creativity. You may not think of doing something differently because you just suck in a rut of somebody else's. And there's a danger that we'll have a bunch of similar applications that are following similar ruts. So there's always this blessing and curse of reuse and of standards. You know, what's the right balance? I'll leave as an exercise for the reader. One project we did back in those days, Bart and I and Alan and some other friends, we set forth to distill applications from a whole bunch of projects and created a system kit, a hot docs template set. This is still available. It's kind of old and a little creaky, but it's free. So if anyone on this call would like a copy, it's a pretty amazing compilation of example templates and interviews, about 500 variables. So if you just want to use standard variables, you can just copy them and use them. Some documentation, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to dwell on that, but I wanted to lay that out for you. And then before I go to the interactive demonstration, these are my words of wisdom. You know, really try to innovate and improve, not reinvent things to the extent you can. That begins with awareness, to just be aware that there might be things you could reuse. And don't forget to apply reuse to your own stuff. So if you're somebody who's done this in a variety of contexts, obviously the first place you look is things you've done yourself. When you're designing an application that might be reused, think about the reusability of it. And don't get too paralyzed by the standards. So let me just leave my slides and get to a little more interesting stuff, which is LawHelp Interactive itself. So here we are, and please anyone jump in, Bart included, especially with any commentary on what I've said or not said. But I am going, of course, to LHI, and as most of you know, there are different kinds of users. And most users come to LHI as a self-helper, as an advocate, and they are logging in and using a specific template, a specific interview that's going to generate documents. They save their answers, they're done. But there's a special category of users known as contributors or providers, and I'm logging in as one of those, which I think is true of most people on this call. And one advantage, of course, of being a contributor is when you log in as a contributor, you have access to this contributor or developer portal. Now it defaults to your own interviews, and by your own, it means the organization of which you're part. So one of my developer groups that I belong to has got a bunch of stuff we're working on. But over here, if you click to the left, you get access to all the interviews on LHI. So there are now over 5,000 modules on LHI, 5,414 to be specific at the moment. And you can just go in here and browse. And if you're curious to try something like how do you evict a tenant in Cook County, which somebody recently updated, you can see it, you can run it and actually run the interview and see how this interview looks. And most importantly for today's call, you can download the content, you can download the source code for it. So I want to illustrate how we do that. That's really the focus today. And I'm going to use a project I'm aware of in American Samoa, just to make this a little more concrete. And well, I've just typed in the word Samoa, which limits it to records that have that word in it, either as the state or as in the title. And we've got 5 of these. A couple of them are done by our colleague Willow Larson, and a couple are done by Jesse Barenfeld, who's a staff person at the the American Samoan Legal Assistance. But let's just to illustrate this principle, say I'm doing a petition for appointment of a guardian, and I'm curious to see what else is on LHI and like that, and I come across this one. I can, as I mentioned, I can go run that, and I can see what would this look like to a user. What am I in for? And Miranda or Bart, let me know if there's any questions or comments we should be addressing in the chat or in the question pane. But here it is. I can behave as an end user. I can check this thing out. I can answer questions. I can see what happens. And I say, gee, this is kind of nice. I'd like to actually get one of these and do something similar. So let me see how it's constructed. And all I'm going to do, I'm going to leave this interview and go back to the contributor portal. One little oddity, I think maybe others have noticed, when you do what I'm doing and you return from a test interview, you have to repeat your search, and it reloads the portal, which can take a second. So let me just quickly do that again. And again, I'm just trying to show the basic mechanics of this. So here we are. So let's take this petition for transfer of property instead. That's just sitting at the top. I have to scroll over to get the right buttons accessible. And now I'm going to press this download interview files. Okay, this is the magic opening sesame to the files. So when I click that, LHI wakes up and says, aha, you want the files, what would you like me to do with them? And most typically, you just want to download it as a zip file, which is what will happen here. So I'm going to download this. And now I've got everything LHI has on this particular module in my local environment. And one thing to be aware of is when you do this is that there are a number of kinds of files that LHI needs to do its work, but you don't need to do your work as a developer. And it turns out that's the majority of these files. There are these manifests, there are these hot docs variable collections or HVC files, and there are these DLL files. And so what I typically do is either extract the entire thing and then delete those unnecessary types, or in this case, I'm just going to go and copy the ones I want, which would be the RTFs. These are the templates. Okay, so there's a petition for the transfer of personal property and an associated blank petition. They're two separate Word documents that are hot docs templates. And then with hot docs, as some of you may know, there's always an associated component file, a CMP file. So I'm going to grab those also. And then finally, there's a CMP, which is the components that actually describes the interview that is being presented to the user. So the files I have highlighted at the moment, these 5 files are the key to the kingdom. I can just copy these and stick them in a local folder. And I've got a empty folder set up over here in my hot docs template hierarchy. And I'm going to paste those 5 files into this local folder. And I've successfully grabbed them from LHI. I don't need to be interacting with the server any longer. And in a second on this slow machine, these files will be copied.
You can also delete the extra files in one fell swoop, like the HVC, XML, JS, etc. You can do a search for *.xml or *HVC, etc., and then that'll show all the ones you don't need, and you can delete them. And I guess you could do the reverse, but that's another way of just cleaning up, because you don't want the stuff gumming up your system. I mean, it won't do any harm, but
right, but I'm with you, Bart. I like to get rid of them because they don't do any harm, but they just take up space and confuse me. But the end result is getting to the ones you care about. So now we've got the key files, and this is Willow's handiwork that I've now grabbed a copy of locally and stuck into a folder. As I say, that is kind of step one. I can close this zip file. I don't need that anymore. I don't really need LHI anymore. I'll leave it open for the moment. But now I'm in Hot Docs. So something similar will happen with A to J. I'm not going to show the A to J process today, but conceptually it's quite similar. So in Hot Docs, one good practice is to create a separate library for each project. So I'm going to create a new library. I'll just call it very creatively ASLA, and Hot Docs will adopt that as the title for the same library. And now I've got an empty new library on my desktop in Hot Docs Developer that I want to populate with those files I was just playing with. So here, I'm going to go over here to add items. And there's going to be two kinds of items I want to add. First of all, the text templates. So now I need to go navigate to where my templates are. And I've got this somewhere in here. You see I got a lot of templates accumulated over the years. So here are the two Word documents, the two RDF templates. I'm going to highlight those two, multiple files. Okay, these are now in my library. And while I'm here, I'm going to add the interview as a separate item. And that's what's called a interview template. And Hot Docs should remind where I just was, but it didn't. So I'll go find it again. And now I want to do, let me get clear which one is which. Here it is, this guy right here. And voila. So I'm almost ready to work. I've got the interview that's running on LHI that actually controls the user interface for a user who's running these templates. And I've got the two templates as Word documents. And keep in mind, again, most of you know this, but in Hot Docs, a library is simply a collection of pointers. So it's just a organized and potentially hierarchical collection of pointers to files of different kinds. But it's a good place to organize your work locally. You can probably get by in many cases without having a library, but often it's needed. So and you can preview things, not the interview itself, because that's not a document, but I can see what this petition looks like. Okay, so here we are in the High Court of American Samoa, and the various Hot Docs variables that are present in my template and the logic around them. And this sometimes in and itself is very instructive and informative to understand how one would construct one of these things. I can do a test assemble, right? So I can run the template and see how it behaves. I can open it for editing, etc. But I'll tell you the thing I most often do, and I'll shut up in a second and give Bart a chance to chime in on some of this. But I'm mostly curious about the interview, because that's going to have all the key variables. It's going to have the logic of my interview. So if I go and open this, I just go to the component manager. Now I see I've got my own private copy of the probably 70 or 80 variables and components that constitute this system. And I can go and look at any of them. This happens to be the closing dialog. If I double click, I can see all it's got is a little bit of closing text. I can double click on that and I can see exactly what's going to appear and how if there's any logic in it, excuse me. I can test this and see, oh, here's what happens. Here's the behavior of that closing dialog. So I've got quite a bit of power to navigate around and understand some of the logic of this thing. I can see all the variables. So if I want to know, just show me all the variables, not the dialogues. I've got number variables and text variables and computations. And one of the most useful and important central computations is the so-called interview. By convention, we write this in caps. It's not actually required, but that makes it a little more understandable. And this here is the script of this particular interview. So it's going to ask the welcome dialog if the user has met the criteria, which is being set based upon answers in that first dialogue, I presume. It's going to do a couple things. If the user says they want to print a blank document, that's all they're going to be assembling, and you're done. If the user says, no, I don't want to print a blank document, I want to actually answer questions and fill this thing out, the interview proceeds. So I'm not going to say much more. Let me just show you, again, like everything else, I can test this. I can see how this thing behaves as an entirety. So now I'm seeing in my local environment that exact same experience that we have on LHI. And I can answer questions here. I can assemble documents and start either copying or just emulating this in my own work. So let me take a breath there. Bart, give you a chance to throw in any thoughts, or Miranda, anybody else. But I wanted to give you a quick tour of how you get this relatively quickly from online into your own world, where you can have at it and do what you want with it.
So one of the things that can be kind of challenging, if you ever download a large package, a lot of interviews involve, sometimes dozens of templates, and so dozens of component files, and templates are inserted into each other, and it can sometimes be kind of a challenge to figure out what's what. One of the things you can do is you can usually figure out if there's a master component file by looking in Windows Explorer at the component files and seeing that there's one that is much bigger than the others, and that gives you a clue that that's probably the master component file, because the ones that point to another component file are usually very small, like the 6,000 byte blank petition, for example. That's typical of an empty one.
Right.
Finding the master template, if there's one template that inserts all the others, that can take quite a bit of hunting around, because you really, sometimes you can tell by the name, like if it's a petition for divorce, there will be a petition for divorce template that inserts a bunch of stuff. But at the end of the day, you do have to open them up individually and look and see, does this one have a whole bunch of inserts in it? That's probably the master template. We also have a question, I don't know if it's that is worth maybe talking about, from Steve Simon.
Sure.
He says, what's your advice about copying and pasting for editing A to J for reuse, since you can't copy pages, let alone groups of pages? So far, I have been just major editing old ones or copying just from one version to another. And I think that's pretty much what you're stuck doing. I don't think there's any way to copy from one interview to another, but that would be something that folks might want to talk to the Cali folks, the publishers of A to J, and see if they're interested in creating some mechanism in the A to J author environment for doing that. Because I think there would be use for it beyond just reuse.
Right.
Translation, for example, it would be helpful if you could copy things from one to another.
Yeah, I have the same reaction, Bart. I think Steve who asked the question, it's relatively primitive ability to copy and paste inside of an A to J interview. I think it got a little better with A to J6, but it's still not quite up to par. And I've heard it being discussed as a feature for the future. So I would defer that to a call with Cali and the A to J folks and push hard. But I think the same spirit applies. And there probably are some techniques that we're missing, but we can't cover them today. Bart's point about, I think I took, an especially simple example that only had 2 templates and 3 component files. It is not uncommon for you to get a whole screen full, if not more, of files. And I think, as Bart said, it's often a little bit head scratching to figure out exactly where the top is and how to organize it. But getting your files into a library, I think, is a good first step. And be aware that in addition to being able to go from the library right to the templates, you can inspect the properties of any of the items. So if you're curious, like I was, for instance, here, like Bart said, usually there's one master component file, which is the biggest, and that's generally the interview. And then each of the component files that accompany the templates are little stubs that are 5 or 6K. I noticed this one has got 24K, which suggests to me that it began life as the main interview, the main template, probably had its variables in it, and then somewhat later in life, Willow, who wrote it, who may be on the call and can answer the question, decided to point it. So it became just a pointer to the master component file. And that's the kind of thing you can figure out by looking at the properties and going to the component properties and see, this one does not share a component file. So theoretically, you may have some variables that are present both in the interview and in one or more of the templates. Just a side note of one of the complexities you sometimes run into. But I wanted to see if anyone has reactions or questions besides the one we just addressed about A to J. We're happy to open this up to talk philosophically or technically about the mechanics of this, but I think this is an important skill to know as a developer. How do you work with stuff that you grabbed and copied from LHI? Anyone want to ask any questions, make a comment?
Again, you can raise your hand. We can take you off of mute. You're also welcome if you have questions or comments more generally about LHI, not specifically about this topic. Please don't be shy.
You can definitely save yourself a lot of work by finding something relatively close to what you're already doing or want to do, and steal as opposed to build, copy.
I think the other thing is that it may be valuable even if you don't copy stuff from one, from an existing interview or a set of components to your reuser's components for one reason or another. It's also good to look if you're doing a project and see, how somebody else approached it. What,
right.
How did they design it? What,
Yeah.
How do they order the questions in the interview? Because there's a lot of things, a lot of decisions you can make that, can make things easier for the user or friendlier for a user, that go well beyond the law and the logic. And there's a lot of interviews on LHI where people have spent an awful lot of time thinking about that kind of thing. What does the interface look like? How do you present help to the user? There are many different ways of doing it, and people are surprised sometimes at how many different ways you can do it. And that's definitely worth it, especially when you're early in the process. I think it's, before you start actually digging into it, it's really good to look and see what other people have done.
In common categories like eviction, it's not uncommon to find dozens, if not hundreds, of existing modules that others have done. So there's 102 that have the word eviction in it, in them. And if you're just about to do that for your jurisdiction, you'll really save you and your users a lot of pain by learning from others. And again, just like I showed you with the example today, you could go and try out as many of these as you like, see how they work. You can find out who created them and find out how to contact them, and download the files, download the content, the source code, and maybe grab a couple different ones and mix and match and make your best combination. And then when you're done, you post it back up to LHI. I think one thing that's important to mention is that it's not only a spirit of contribution, but as a contributor, a card carrying LHI contributor, template provider, you have agreed to share your work, and you've agreed that if you copy somebody else's work, that you will only use it for nonprofit purposes. So I think Miranda, I wanted to get that point in about the terms that that folks agreed to.
Thank you, Mark.
So that's what I wanted to get at. I don't want to prolong this, but I wanted to give you a flavor of mechanics and the philosophy behind it. And we do have time for comments or questions if folks have them. And I'll be quiet for a second. Hearing none, Miranda, I'll turn it back to you if you want to wrap up or do any closing comments on today's call.
Thank you, Mark. I'll go ahead and grab the screen then. Okay, that took a moment. So yeah, it's interesting to think about this idea of reusing content in our terms of use. Not only is it our practice and our requirements that people share, but it's also the culture of the LHI community, and that's one of the things I'm grateful for. People have been very generous in sharing their expertise and collaborating with new programs. I've reached out to some more established LHI users, and they've always been open to talking to folks just getting started out. So just that's one of the things I've been grateful for in a really uniquely challenging year. So I don't want to hold you, but I just wanted to end by saying thank you for joining today, but thank you more generally for being part of the LHI community. Please reach out for newer folks on the call if you have any questions about LHI, if you want some of the basics. And for our established users and partners, also please feel free to reach out if you have any feedback or questions. Keep an eye out because we're also going to be circulating our developer and partner survey. So we want to hear about your experience in LHI in 2020, what we did well, what we could work on for the next year, things that we use those surveys to kind of help shape our roadmap and our priorities for the next year, but also to report back to our funders. So I hope everyone has a great rest of 2020 and stay safe. And thank you again, Bart and Mark.
You're welcome. Same to you, Miranda. Take care, guys.